we fulfilled the days of unleavened bread in the last 2 weeks. We began to count from that time 50 days. We start that count from the Sunday following the start of the days of unleavened bread. The Sunday end during the days of unleavened bread. This year, the first day of unleavened bread was on a Sabbath, so the very next day was the wave sheath, and then began counting the 50 days of unleavened bread. Today is the 14th day, the second Sabbath. We count 7 Sabbaths, and then one more day, and it's 50 days. So this is the 14th day that we have counted. During that time, as we go from, in our spiritual journey from the leaving of Egypt and backed up against the Red Sea, our baptism, which takes away the power of Satan, the devil, over us, and then after our baptism, which is pictured by the 7th day of unleavened bread, we have a period of rejoicing, but then we take from there and we begin a lifelong journey, which is pictured by 40 years in the wilderness. It took the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, and I would say there are several warnings to us in their experience early on during that period of time. It took them 3 days to go from rejoicing after all they had seen and experienced. You and I have seen and experienced a lot, but then after 3 days they began to murmur against God. First of all, because they didn't have water and the water was bitter. And then following that, very shortly, they murmured because they didn't have enough food. Going ahead further, they started to long for and look back to Egypt. The world around us would be the analogy that's being constructed, that we can sort of get tired of all of the fare that God has provided for us, and we can look back to all of the things that were available in the world, and we can want to return to those things. That is a warning for us. They longed for cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. All of those things we might liken to many of the things that go on around us in the world that are so attractive to us that would pull us away from this same old manna that God has provided for us. And so those are warnings that are given to us. But we're also at a time when we are thinking, planning, and even yesterday I had pictures that came from Horseheads of a garden which was being planted, which will begin to be harvested and will result ultimately in a great fall harvest. So we have these warnings, but we also have the instruction that we are to reflect a newness of life, and as we plant and move forward, we look forward to that. Today I wanted to cover with you in the sermonette one verse of Scripture from Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, which sort of paints this contrast for us and helps us to consider what our response is supposed to be. We are to be transformed, somewhat like the planting of seeds in a garden, and not conformed like the Israelites were in looking for those days to turn back to. To look to the things of the world around us to turn back to. Let's look at that verse of Scripture and read it. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Paul writes to the church in Rome, Do not be conformed to this world. You came out of Egypt. We're out of Egypt. We're separate from it. We have a whole different life. We're looking forward to the future. So do not be conformed to this world. Now that we've gone through this period of time, let's keep it on our mind as we go forward that that is what we escaped from, and we don't want to go back to it. Not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Now that's a kind of play on similar sounding words, isn't it? Almost rhymes. Not conformed, but transformed. And yet we see that there's a contrast there. The meanings of those two words are actually pretty much opposite. Antonyms, for you young people who learn the distinction between different related forms of words. These are antonyms, opposites in many ways toward each other. But be you transformed, and there's a methodology then that follows this instruction about how it is that we are supposed to be transformed. Transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So let's look for a minute at this contrast. The first part I wanted to look at was the transformed part, because that represents a positive direction, something that we should be focusing really our attention on, to be transformed. The word in Greek is metamorpho. M-E-T-A-M-O-R-P-H-O-O. Metamorpho. To transform, or to metamorphosize. Completely change. To transfigure, or to transform. Strong's Exhaustive Concordance has that to say, and those synonyms about that word. To be transformed. We think of course, the butterfly, or we have some insects we might wish didn't get transformed, that come out and afflict our, our fruit trees and our crops, but there is a laying of eggs, and then the laying of those eggs turns into a chrysalis, which if you open the chrysalis up near the time when the hatching occurs, you will see it is just a worm. But in a very short period of time, that worm is transformed into a very beautiful butterfly. And that's the context of the word that we are looking at here. Be you transformed. Don't be the ugly worm in the cocoon. Be the beautiful butterfly, mentally and spiritually speaking, which reflects God's way. So that's the first word in the contrast. The other word in the contrast is do not be conformed. Now, conformed is the word suschazimo, S-U-S-C-H-E-M-A-T-I-Z-O. And it means to fashion yourself alike, to be like something. Conform to, it says, the same pattern. All of the world around us is operating pretty much in the same pattern. If we want to put it in one word, we could say confusion. Another word, we might say disobedience. So the world is operating under a state of confusion and disobedience. And it says, do not be conformed to this world. Do not be sociasmizo. Rather, we were instructed to be metamorpho, transformed. And so those two words are contrast. One is just to be the same old, as is all around you. The other is to break out and to be a completely different form of being. So it says in this scripture, do not be conformed, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove. Now I'd like to focus in a little bit on this word prove as well, because that doesn't give us the real sense of what has been said here in this scripture. The word in Greek is dokimazo, D-O-K-I-M-A-Z-O. And Strong says about it, you may test, or you may approve, you may allow, that you may discern, examine, prove, or try. It says that you may prove what is good. Really, I think what Paul is saying here, if I have to select one of these words and apply it to this particular verse of Scripture, Paul is saying that you discern, you are able to make the judgment by the renewing of your mind, that you're able to make the judgment, you're able to discern that which is good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Mentality here in this verse of Scripture is the key. It says here, you're to be transformed, and we're not going to be transformed physically. I mean, I've gotten a lot older, so maybe I have been transformed physically. There was a time I was young and spry and fast and strong and athletic. I have, you might say, at least in that sense, have been transformed by the passing of the years. And probably a lot of us can feel that way, or we're on the way to that, one way or the other. If we're young and just getting started, we may be expecting and understanding that we're going to be transformed. So that's a kind of transformation, but that's not the kind of transformation that Paul is recommending here. He's saying, by the renewing of your mind. We went through that. We renew our mind every year. That's what the days of unleavened bread really picture for us, that we return to the core values that we have committed ourselves to in our lives. And now, because we have renewed those, we're going to live our life in an entirely different way. And we will prove, we will be able to discern. Because our mind has been renewed, our whole approach to things has been changed, we will be able to discern. Prove means discern here, in this case. That which is good, acceptable, and the perfect will of God. So mentality is the key. Transforming our mind gives us the ability to make the discernment. Question: have we, since the days of unleavened bread, been more able, as our capacity increased, have we been more able to discern the difference between the way of this world and the way of God? That's what Paul has to say here in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's the method by which he's saying do it. That you may prove that which is good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. 3 adjectives there. Good, acceptable, and perfect. They're modifying the will of God. And so the key is be transformed, not conformed.